here, and I'm so sorry I'm late. Essentially, the bus didn't come, then the bus did come, but then there was this old woman counting change for the fare, like nickel, penny. Like, geez, Louise, let this woman on the bus. She's 107 years old. These are some of her last few moments of life.
Resume.
Ezra Miller was not like the others in Hollywood. From a very young age, you could feel that something was different about them. They were smart, emotional, and full of energy that was hard to ignore. Born in New Jersey, Ezra didn't have the normal childhood most kids do. They struggled with speaking clearly and used singing to help overcome their speech problems. That's where their connection to performing began, not with acting, but with voice, music, and expression. As a teenager, Ezra didn't want to fit into a box. They were proud to be unique, proud to be loud, and proud to be themselves, no matter what others thought. When Ezra stepped into the world of acting, people quickly saw that this wasn't just another child actor looking for fame. There was something magnetic about them, something powerful, something mysterious. Their breakout role in After School already showed signs of raw talent and deep emotion, but it was the perks of being a wallflower that made the world stop and look closer. In that movie, Ezra didn't just act. They made people feel things they hadn't felt in years. Critics said Ezra was fearless, brilliant, and full of soul. Fans said they finally saw someone in Hollywood who didn't pretend to be perfect, someone who was different, just like them. Ezra quickly became a symbol of breaking rules and challenging normal ideas, especially about gender and identity. They weren't afraid to say, "I'm not a man," or "a woman, I'm just me," and many people admired that strength. They wore what they wanted, spoke what they felt, and refused to play by Hollywood's old-fashioned rules. While other stars were carefully managed and trained to smile for the cameras, Ezra often showed up wild, loud, and completely unfiltered. At first, people loved it. It felt refreshing. Ezra was seen as bold, brave, and true to themselves in a world full of fake images. Their casting as the Flash in the DC universe felt like a new chapter not just for Ezra, but for Hollywood itself. Here was a young, non-traditional star being trusted with one of the biggest superhero roles in the world. Fans were excited, and even those who didn't know much about Ezra started to believe they were witnessing the rise of a new kind of hero, both on screen and off. But behind the lights and the fame, there were quiet whispers that something didn't feel right. People who worked on set with Ezra began to notice things: mood swings, outbursts, long silences, followed by loud laughter. Some thought it was just the price of genius. Others weren't so sure. It's often said that Hollywood loves a rebel until the rebel becomes hard to control. Ezra had a way of pulling attention without even trying, but not all attention was good. Interviews started to feel strange. Fans would ask for photos, and sometimes Ezra would smile kindly. Other times they would act cold or walk away without a word. These moments didn't make the headlines, not yet, but they started building a pattern. The media still called them iconic, free-spirited, and daring, but close observers started asking a darker question. Was Ezra just misunderstood, or were they starting to lose control? Their fashion became more extreme, their quotes more confusing, and their public appearances more unpredictable. In one red carpet moment, Ezra showed up dressed as a giant puffed-up alien, posing like a ghost from a dream. People laughed, took photos, and called it art, but others felt uneasy. Was this creative expression or a cry for help? Fame has a way of making people blind to warning signs. When you are famous, people laugh at things that would normally cause concern. They call it eccentric instead of strange. They say they're just being themselves instead of wondering if something deeper is going on. For Ezra, the lines were starting to blur. The bright young star who once inspired young people to be bold and different was beginning to show cracks in the spotlight. But instead of slowing down, Hollywood pushed harder. Bigger roles, more press, more pressure. Behind the scenes, it was becoming harder to manage Ezra's behavior. But in front of the cameras, everything looked fine, at least for now. Fame gives you power, but it also traps you. The world watches your every move, and even the smallest mistake becomes a headline. Ezra was now living in that pressure every day. The child who once sang to find their voice was now surrounded by noise so loud they couldn't think clearly. The early part of Ezra Miller's story is filled with promise, magic, and mystery. They gave people hope that Hollywood could change, that it could become a place for people who don't fit the mold. But slowly, that dream started to turn into a question mark. Were we watching the birth of a legend, or the slow, painful fall of someone too fragile for the world they were thrown into? This was just the beginning. The story that started with beauty and talent was already beginning to take a strange and unsettling turn, and no one, not even Ezra, seemed ready for what was coming next. Fame can be a beautiful dream, but sometimes that dream slowly turns into something darker, something you can't escape from. And for Ezra Miller, the signs began to appear, even when the world still saw them as a rising star. After winning hearts with their powerful performance in The Perks of Being a Wallflower, Ezra was celebrated as someone who didn't follow the rules, someone who lived boldly and freely, someone Hollywood had been waiting for. They became the face of a new kind of celebrity, one who wasn't afraid to speak their mind or break the old ideas about gender, image, and behavior. But as the spotlight grew stronger, the cracks beneath the surface began to show. Behind the bright red carpets and flashing cameras, something didn't feel right anymore. Ezra started showing up at events acting strangely. One day they were warm and excited, laughing with fans and speaking about love and freedom. The next day, they seemed cold, distant, or angry. Their moods shifted quickly, and people close to them began to feel uncomfortable, like walking near a storm that could break out at any moment. At first, Ezra was just being artistic or deep, but slowly the odd behavior became harder to ignore. During interviews, Ezra sometimes spoke in riddles, using words that confused even experienced reporters. They talked about the universe, power, danger, and spirits, but no one really understood what they meant. Some fans thought they were being mysterious on purpose. Others began to worry that something inside Ezra was slipping away. But in Hollywood, when someone brings in millions of dollars, people don't always ask questions. They stay quiet, they look the other way, and they tell themselves that everything is fine. While the public still saw Ezra as a symbol of bold self-expression, the people working behind the scenes were dealing with a different version of the star. One that was becoming more unpredictable, more explosive, and sometimes even dangerous. Crew members whispered about sudden outbursts during filming. People said Ezra would disappear for hours without explanation. Some said they saw Ezra screaming at people for no reason, but these stories never made it to the news. They were kept quiet, buried under the weight of Ezra's fame and the success of The Flash. Still, the feeling of unease grew stronger. There were rumors that Ezra had started believing strange things, that they were chosen for something greater, that they had powers beyond normal people, that they were somehow above the law. These weren't just private thoughts. Ezra spoke about them in public, claiming to be a messiah and talking about changing the world in ways that confused everyone. People laughed at these moments, calling them weird or funny, but deep down there was a growing fear that something inside Ezra was falling apart. It wasn't just words, it was actions too. Ezra began dressing in ways that felt less like fashion and more like signs. Giant puffy costumes, dark makeup, strange symbols on their clothes. Everything they did seemed to be sending a message, but no one could understand what it was. The world kept watching, confused and curious, unsure if this was a performance or a real breakdown happening in slow motion. Some of their friends tried to help, but Ezra didn't listen. They pushed people away, claimed they didn't need help, and said the world just didn't get them. Hollywood still needed Ezra. The Flash movie was in production and millions of dollars were on the line. So instead of helping, the industry did what it always does. It protected the image, not the person. It fixed the public's view while ignoring the private reality. But there was only so much hiding that could be done. More and more stories began to leak. Small incidents, strange behavior, and rumors of violence. Each new story was like another piece of a puzzle no one wanted to finish. The person once loved for their honesty and freedom now seemed trapped in their own mind, lost between reality and fantasy. Ezra's life was starting to spin out of control, and even those who supported them in the beginning started to step back. It was no longer about fashion or identity or being different. It was about something deeper, something that felt like it could lead to disaster. Fans started asking questions. What was really going on with Ezra Miller? Why did they seem so lost, so angry, so disconnected from the world? Was this still the person who inspired millions with a smile? Or had fame created a new version of them, one that was darker and more dangerous? As Ezra's behavior grew stranger, the media slowly shifted its tone. At first they were kind, then careful, and finally they couldn't stay silent anymore. The headlines began changing. The photos became more serious. The excitement turned to concern. The whispers had become shouts. But even then, the full truth remained hidden. What was happening behind closed doors? Why did the people who knew the most stay so quiet for so long? Was Ezra being protected, or were they being ignored in the darkest hour? These questions didn't have clear answers, but the feeling in the air was heavy. Everyone could sense it. Something bad was coming. The fall hadn't happened yet, but the storm clouds were building, and for a star who once shined so brightly, the shadow growing over Ezra Miller was impossible to miss. This was no longer just a story about fame. It was becoming something else entirely, something mysterious, something painful, and something no one could stop. The warning signs had been there all along, but now it was too late to pretend. The next chapter was about to begin, and it wouldn't be pretty. Everything started changing the moment Ezra Miller made headlines, not for their acting or style, but for something much darker, something that shocked even their biggest fans. The charming and creative star, who once walked red carpets with bold outfits and strange ideas, suddenly appeared in a disturbing video. In Iceland, a fan walked up to Ezra playfully, but what happened next left the world in complete confusion. Ezra grabbed the fan by the neck and forced them to the ground. It was caught on camera. People thought it was a joke at first. Maybe they were acting, maybe it was staged, but no one was laughing. The video spread like wildfire, and the questions began. Why would someone so beloved and admired do something so aggressive? And why did no one stop them? There was no arrest, no apology, no explanation, just silence. And that silence felt heavy, like something was being hidden. The public tried to move on, but things didn't get better, they got worse. Ezra began showing up in news stories again and again, but now it was for violent outbursts, police reports, and strange behavior in different parts of the world. In Hawaii, they were arrested twice. Once for yelling at people in a bar and grabbing a microphone from a woman who was singing karaoke. Another time for throwing a chair at someone's head. Each time it sounded more unreal, like something out of a movie. But this wasn't a script, this was real life. And people were getting hurt. And still, no real punishment. No serious charges, no press conferences. It felt like Ezra was being protected by something bigger, something invisible. Fans started asking, how does a person get arrested so many times and still walk free? What is going on behind the scenes? While these public incidents shocked people, what came next was even more disturbing. A couple in Hawaii filed a restraining order against Ezra, saying they broke into their room, threatened them, and stole personal items. The couple said Ezra told them something terrifying, that they were a messiah, that they would bury the man and his wife. These were not just strange words, they were threats. The order was dropped later, but the fear stayed. And it didn't end there. Soon after, Ezra was accused of much more serious things. A young Native American activist's parents said Ezra had been controlling their daughter since she was a child. They claimed Ezra gave her drugs, isolated her from her family, and used manipulation to keep control over her. The girl was only 12 when they met Ezra, and now she was 18, traveling with them, acting strangely, and cutting ties with everyone she knew. The parents said Ezra used their fame and money to influence the girl's mind. It sounded like a horror story. Could the same person who once played a superhero now be accused of leading someone into a dangerous, controlling situation? Ezra denied the accusations, and the girl defended them, saying she was fine, but the damage was done. More stories began to surface. Other families came forward, saying Ezra had behaved in the same way with their children, offering friendship, gifts, and then slowly isolating them. It started to feel like a pattern, a very dark pattern. Ezra was no longer just a troubled star. They were now surrounded by allegations of grooming, emotional abuse, and psychological control. People asked again, Why is no one doing anything? Why are they still free? And why is Warner Brothers, the studio behind The Flash, still supporting Ezra as if nothing is happening? At this point, fans were divided. Some still believed in Ezra, thinking they were misunderstood or going through a mental health crisis. Others were angry, heartbroken, and terrified. They didn't know what to believe anymore. The media began reporting more details. Ezra carrying weapons, wearing a bulletproof vest, believing people were following them, and saying they were chosen to lead something spiritual. The more they spoke, the more it felt like Ezra was living in a different world, a world full of paranoia, danger, and strange beliefs. They weren't just losing touch with Hollywood, they were losing touch with reality, and the people around them were scared, very scared. At one point, authorities were searching for Ezra across different states. They were on the run, moving from place to place with young people in their company, while families begged for help, but Ezra stayed ahead. No arrests, no answers, only more mystery. Each week, a new piece of the puzzle came out, but no one could see the full picture. What was really going on? Was this a celebrity meltdown or something far more sinister? Was Ezra sick or dangerous or both? And why did it seem like the world was too afraid to speak the full truth? The person who once inspired so many had become someone people were scared to talk about. And the silence from Hollywood grew louder. The Flash was still being promoted. Commercials showed Ezra as a hero, while the real Ezra was hiding, surrounded by legal problems and disturbing rumors. It felt like we were watching two different versions of reality, one on the screen and one in the shadows, and the shadow was growing darker by the day. This was no longer just a fall from grace. It was a story filled with fear, confusion, and deep emotional pain. The fans who once cheered now cried. The children who once looked up to Ezra now asked questions their parents couldn't answer. And the world waited, watching closely as the story of Ezra Miller continued to spiral into something no one had ever expected. The deeper people looked into Ezra Miller's life, the more frightening things became. And what once felt like a few strange incidents now began to look like a pattern far too dark to ignore. It wasn't just a celebrity acting out or a famous person struggling with pressure. It was something more serious, something that involved real people, real victims, and real fear. What made it even scarier was how each story seemed connected, like pieces of a much larger mystery. Ezra wasn't just facing a few legal problems anymore. They were being accused of creating chaos wherever they went, and every new report seemed to reveal more disturbing behavior. One of the most shocking stories came from a family in North Dakota who claimed that Ezra had taken control of their daughter's life in ways that felt terrifying. They said Ezra had met her when she was just 12 years old, and from that moment, slowly began to influence her, change the way she saw her parents, and separate her from everyone who truly cared about her. The parents said their daughter had stopped listening to them and now only listened to Ezra. She left home and began traveling with Ezra, staying in hotels, on farms, and even in other people's houses, while completely cutting off her family. The parents believed Ezra had brainwashed her, but when they tried to speak out and get help, it was already too late. A daughter defended Ezra, said everything was fine and the law couldn't do much because she was now considered an adult. This wasn't the only story like this. Another mother from Massachusetts came forward saying Ezra had developed a strange relationship with her 11-year-old child. She said Ezra visited their home, offered to buy the child a horse, and spoke about spiritual energies and dark forces, things that scared her family. She got a restraining order against Ezra, but even that didn't make the news in a big way. More people began telling similar stories. Young people being pulled into Ezra's world, families being cut off, and strange things happening in private spaces. Ezra wasn't acting alone either. There were reports that they were moving around with weapons, wearing body armor, and claiming they were being hunted by the FBI or the Ku Klux Klan. These were not small lies or silly stories. These were serious claims that suggested Ezra was living in a different reality, one where they were always the hero and everyone else was a threat. People who used to be close to Ezra said they didn't recognize them anymore. They said Ezra had changed, not just emotionally, but mentally. They spoke about Ezra being paranoid, talking to invisible things and believing they had a special mission to lead others. Some even believed Ezra thought they were some kind of prophet. But the scariest part wasn't just the strange behavior. It was that nothing was being done to stop it. Law enforcement seemed unable or unwilling to take real action. Even when Ezra was found with guns, drugs, or young people in strange places, they were not arrested or charged seriously. This made the public even more confused and afraid. How could someone accused of so many disturbing things still be walking free? How could Hollywood continue to work with Ezra as if nothing had happened? Some people began to wonder if Ezra was being protected by powerful people who didn't want the truth to come out because too much money was involved. Others thought the system simply didn't know how to handle someone who was both famous and dangerous. No one wanted to be the one to say out loud what everyone was thinking, that Ezra Miller was not just a troubled actor, but possibly a threat to others. Behind the scenes, things got even stranger. A woman claimed that Ezra kept her and her 3 children on a farm in Vermont, where there were guns left all around, even near the children. She said Ezra told her the world was ending and that they had to prepare for war. When people tried to check on the children, Ezra refused to let them in. When child services came to investigate, Ezra disappeared with the family, and no one could find them for weeks. That's when people really began to panic. Where was Ezra? Were the children safe? Why was no one stopping this? It felt like a nightmare that kept getting worse. Ezra's name kept showing up in reports, but they were always gone by the time police arrived. Some said they had gone into hiding, others said they were being protected. But no matter what the truth was, it was clear that something had gone very wrong. And still, Warner Brothers stayed silent. The studio continued to support Ezra's role as the Flash, even promoting the film while all of these terrifying stories were out in public. Fans felt betrayed. How could a company pretend nothing was happening while families were crying out for help? How could a movie matter more than the safety of children and young people? The silence from Hollywood made the mystery even darker. If Ezra wasn't being stopped now, what would it take? Would someone have to get hurt or worse before people opened their eyes? The sad part is that many of the people first spoke out about Ezra were ignored. They were told they were overreacting or lying. But their stories were all too similar, too detailed, too real to be fake. And as more people came forward, it became harder to look away. This was no longer about protecting a star. This was about protecting the truth, protecting the innocent, and asking the hard questions no one wanted to ask. What really happened to Ezra Miller? How did a person who once stood for freedom and truth become the center of so much fear and confusion? And how many people were hurt while the world stayed quiet, hoping the problem would just disappear? The truth was right in front of everyone, but it seemed like no one wanted to see it. And that is the most terrifying part of all. As the world kept turning and the news cycle moved on, many thought Ezra Miller's story would fade quietly into the background, like so many other Hollywood scandals that came and went without real answers. But what happened next didn't just bring the mystery back to life. It made everything feel more disturbing than ever before. Just when people started to think things couldn't get any worse, Ezra reappeared in public, not with an apology or explanation, but with a smile, standing at the premiere of The Flash, posing for cameras, surrounded by lights, fans, and powerful people in the film industry. It felt like a surreal moment, almost like a bad dream. After everything, after the arrests, the accusations, the missing people, the weapons, the restraining orders, the rumors of grooming and manipulation, Ezra was back in the spotlight, being celebrated like nothing had happened. People around the world stared at their screens in shock. How could this be happening? Why was this person, who had been at the center of so many disturbing stories, still being treated like a star? The film studio behind The Flash remained quiet, offering only a few brief statements about Ezra's mental health and ongoing treatment, but never once addressing the deeper questions. They didn't talk about the families who were still afraid, or the young people who had disappeared for months while traveling with Ezra, or the strange spiritual messages Ezra posted online claiming to be some kind of prophet or chosen one. None of that was discussed. Instead, the focus was on the movie, the box office, and the brand. It was clear that the machine of Hollywood had made its choice to protect the image, even if it meant ignoring the pain. What made this moment even harder to accept was how carefully everything had been managed. Public relations teams had been working behind the scenes to shift the narrative, turning Ezra's story from one of danger to one of healing. They talked about recovery and redemption, about second chances and mental illness, trying to make the public feel sympathy instead of fear. But for many people, that didn't feel honest. It felt like a cover-up, like an attempt to make us forget what had really happened. Because behind every carefully written press release was a real person who'd been hurt, a child who had been isolated from their family, a mother who had begged for help, a fan who had once admired Ezra and now felt confused, scared, and betrayed. These were not just stories, they were cries for justice that had never been answered. Even now, some of the people connected to the worst parts of the story remain silent, either too afraid to speak or legally blocked from sharing what they know. Some sources claim there are hidden settlements, private deals, and threats of lawsuits if the truth comes out. Others believe that certain people in power don't want the full story told because it would expose too much, not just about Ezra, but about the system that let this happen. And so the mystery grows. People are still asking questions, but the answers feel further away than ever. What really happened during those months when Ezra disappeared with children and young people? Why were the police unable to locate them for so long? What role did powerful studios play in protecting Ezra from real consequences? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, has the worst part of this story already happened, or is it still coming? Because some believe the silence is not a sign that things are over, but a warning that something darker still hides in the shadow. There are rumors that more victims may come forward, that more families may share their stories, that more evidence might still exist, buried or hidden or locked behind legal walls. And if that happens, the house of cards could collapse quickly. But until then, the world waits. It waits in discomfort, in confusion, and in fear. Because what happened with Ezra Miller is not just about one actor. It's about a broken system that can turn danger into dollars, that can silence the weak and reward the powerful, that can turn real pain into entertainment and call it art. People once looked up to Ezra as a symbol of change, someone who challenged old rules and showed the world what it meant to live freely, but that dream has been replaced by something else, something darker, something sadder, something we still don't fully understand. The story of Ezra Miller's downfall did not end with a trial or an apology. It ended with a red carpet, a movie premiere, and a carefully staged return to fame, while the truth remained hidden behind smiles, suits, and silence. And now, as the cameras fade and the headlines slow down, the real question begins to rise louder than ever. What happens next? Will the world finally wake up and demand answers? Or will this just become another dark chapter in Hollywood's long history of looking away when the truth becomes too ugly to face? Only time will tell. But for now, the mystery remains, and the silence says more than words ever could.